All right, I guess we'll get started. So welcome everybody for this info session. So I'm Asher Cutter. I'm a professor here. I recognize some of your faces from class and around Earth Sciences building. And what I was hoping to do today is to talk a little bit about how to apply to grad school in general, and then some features of the grad program about here in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology department in particular, because that's the program I know best. That said, I did my PhD elsewhere, and I've spent time at many different institutions around the world. So I can also give some perspective on that. And so for today, what I thought I'd do, I'd just run through kind of a few quick slides as kind of context to load up into your heads. And then we'll have 3 grad student panelists that will introduce themselves and can tell you a little bit about kind of how they made their decisions and what they were thinking when they were in your shoes not so long ago, and any advice and things like that. And of course, I'm also happy to address that. So to kind of start out with, so what is a grad program and what is kind of our EEB grad program in particular? So it's a place where you can pursue academic training after your undergrad, which in the sciences is kind of becoming a more intrinsic part of kind of moving on to a diverse range of careers. So it used to be a long time ago the case that with a bachelor's degree in science, you were well prepared for many kind of jobs, and the kind of now that most people actually in Canada at least get a post-high school degree of some kind, the needle is kind of shifted a bit. So in our program here in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology department, we have 2 basic kinds of post-grad degrees. There's a research-based master's degree. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a second, and a research-based PhD degree. So those are different from some other programs that you might have on your radar that are primarily course-based. There might be a project, but that's not a key component of it. And typically a course-based master's program, you would pay to be a student, much like you currently are as an undergraduate. Whereas for a research-based program, you're actually paid to further your training in that area. And we can go into that a little bit more too. Some details about the grad program here at U of T. Well, we have this graduate program that is tri-campus. So while you may be an undergrad student at U of T St. George or Mississauga or Scarborough, and those operate, as you know, fairly independently at the undergrad level. At the grad level, you actually tap into the research expertise of all the faculty in those disciplines. So at the St. George campus here, we have about 25 faculty in the EEB department, but across the 3 campuses, we have 50 or more faculty that can supervise students. And altogether, we have about 150 graduate students pursuing a master's or PhD program of study. I'll also mention that while there's kind of the regular profs that you have in class, we also have some folks that serve as supervisors that are curators at the Royal Ontario Museum. Some are actually have research appointments through one of the government ministries like Division of Fisheries and Oceans or Natural Resources. And there are a couple of other folks that are kind of connected, even though their primary research appointment might be in a different program, they can still take students through EEB if that makes sense for the research projects. Okay. I'll also mention that I was kind of alluding to that our master's and PhD programs are fully funded. So what that means is that we have a guaranteed period during which you will receive a stipend of a certain amount. Okay, and I'll go into maybe a little bit more about that in a minute. So, and what you do when you're doing a master's or PhD, you've encountered these folks probably when you've had TAs in your courses, in your labs. Those are typically master's or PhD students. And what they're doing is spending most of their time on their research project, their research thesis, okay? And so it is individualized. If you've done like a summer NSERC or EEB 498 type of course credit type project, that's kind of like the baby version of what their master's or PhD would be. And so there, as you probably well know, if you've had those experiences, you know, you're not on your own in sort of developing that. You have a mentor, a supervisor who helps you to shape what it will be, as well as a supervisory committee. So when you're a master's or PhD student, you have a supervisory committee that typically has your kind of primary mentor, whose lab you're probably working closely with, and then two other professors who have complementary expertise, and you meet with them all together on a regular basis. You're required to meet with them on a regular basis to kind of talk about your project in different ways. And so it's a way to kind of tap into getting that expertise. So in contrast to kind of the faculty student ratio in undergrad, where in like Bio 120, it's like 2,000 students to 2 professors. In a PhD, it's 1 student to 3 professors. So it kind of flips around in terms of how the mentorship works. So I'll also say that it's not just getting input and insight from professors, but there's these 150 other grad students that we have, right? And so they're at different levels of different stages in their program. And so they're a really valuable resource for also getting input and advice and practical things. I mean, I often am talking to my students about saying, oh, you should go talk to this other student in the lab who actually does this all the time, and they can give you a lot of input that way. So there's a huge amount of research expertise. In our program, I mean, if you're students here at U of T, you probably know that we have concentrations in a variety of different areas, ranging from thinking about biodiversity and systematics to conservation, ecology and evolution of disease, as well as kind of population ecology, community ecology, and ecosystem ecology. On the genetics side, we have things related to evolutionary genetics, genomics, and molecular evolution, as well as connecting behavior and neurobiology, or like more straight up using math and computing, theoretical and computational approaches to studying key questions. So I mentioned how we have master's and PhD programs. So it's slightly more complicated in that when you to think about, and I'll tell you why in a second. So one, for the master's program, it's actually a pretty short program that we have for our master's program. It's just 16 months. So if you're considering master's programs at other places, that's something to look into. One, to see if it jives with what you're hoping to get out of graduate school, or what you're hoping to do afterward. And because it's a research focus, it really has pretty minimal coursework, basically 1 course. Okay, so you can see already how kind of the priorities are pretty different from your undergrad, where, you know, if you're taking like 5 courses a term or something, here you're taking 1 course over 16 months. Okay, the master's program, unfortunately, is only available to Canadian citizens and permanent residents. So international students we can't admit into our master's program, although at some other universities, they may also allow international students if a master's is really what you're hoping to go for. And really, in terms of transcript, we're looking primarily at the most recent 2 years of your undergrad. For the PhD program, this is where it's slightly more complicated. We actually have 2 ways to enter, because I think most all of you are bachelor's students. The thing most relevant to you right now would be what we call a direct entry. And for that admission pathway, there's 5 years of guaranteed funding support. And like I said, all these are research focused, and here there's just 2 FCE of coursework. So basically 4 courses during that time. So typically PhD students would finish their coursework by around year 3. We also have some courses that are these modules. So for U of T students, that means like instead of having a 0.5 FCE course, it would be a 0.25 FCE module, and you can take a couple of those. And so sometimes it's like a workshop that's just concentrated into a few weeks. Some students will choose to do a master's degree, and then after think, oh, actually, I want to do a PhD, but I want to maybe do it in a different place or in a different lab or something like that, in which case you can apply for our the alternate PhD admission pathway, which is typically after you've done a research-based master's in the discipline of ecology and evolution of some type. And there's 4 years of guaranteed funding. There's a little bit less coursework. And all of these PhD programs are available to both Canadian and non-Canadian applicants. I mentioned that our grad programs are fully funded. So what that means is that for these amounts of time, so 60 months master's, 4 or 5 years of PhD, grad students are guaranteed a stipend of $34,000 a year for the PhD and about $30,000 a year for the master's. Of course, for the extra 4 months, it's kind of prorated to that amount, meaning that you divide it by 3 for the extra 4 months. Let's see, and that's net of tuition and fees. So actually the gross amount that you get paid is about $42,000 or $43,000 for the case of the PhD, but U of T charges you tuition, and so you have to pay like the $8,000 or $9,000 in tuition. So the amount that you have for living expenses is this $30,000 or $34,000. The way that those funds are put together is actually kind of annoyingly complicated, but this is something that's kind of important, especially if you're thinking about grad programs looking at different places, to have a sense of how it actually works in practice and like what it would mean for you. And also so you can compare apples to apples, right? So in our case, the financing comes from a few ways. So one source is there's university fellowship funds. That just means money that the provincial government gives to the university that then gives to departments that we can then distribute to students. A second piece is our department has a number of endowed funds that we can then disperse to graduate students as essentially bursaries that you don't have to apply for particularly. Then in our case, we have a system where you apply to work with a particular professor, or you're admitted to be supervised by a particular professor. And so they are also, in addition to being kind of intellectually responsible for you, they are also financially responsible for a portion of your stipend and what we call a research assistantship. So it's different than how an RA works in, I think, like in the humanities, where you're essentially a worker for a professor to collect some information for them. In our discipline, an RA means that you're kind of collaborating with your supervisor on a shared project of interest, but it's really your thesis work that you're getting paid to do. And then the last part is as a teaching assistantship. So this is probably how you've encountered grad students most commonly here at U of T. It says TAs in your courses. So we typically, a standard TA in our department works out to about 140 hours over the course of the academic year, so about 70 hours per term. So that works out to like 5 or 6 hours a week is what it's supposed to be. It's a unionized component of this. That's the only part that's unionized with respect to the stipend. So it's very rigid as to like what the contracts are and the amount of work and the time of work and stuff like that. I'll mention that this is actually a pretty modest amount of TA responsibilities that we have, especially compared to many other institutions. Partly we do that intentionally as part of the program because we are really a research intense kind of program. And so we really want to make it possible for students to devote most of their time and energy towards doing research and not things that are other than that, if possible. But I just mentioned that because that's an important piece to think about if you're comparing different programs. What are the expectations for teaching responsibilities? So for example, where I did my PhD at the University of Arizona in the US, a TA position was 20 hours a week. So 3 to 4 times more than like what we have here typically, and a longer term for each semester. Okay. I'm just going to kind of run through this, and then we can always come back for specific questions, which I'm sure many of you may have. Okay, so, hopefully you've thought about this question a little bit, which is partly why you're here. So why to pursue grad training? Well, kind of the big blue sky kind of view is that really it's the way that we generate new knowledge, right? So it's about through research, gaining discovery to understand how the world works. Okay, so that's kind of the big blue sky picture of things. Here at U of T, our EEB department is actually the only one in Canada. In that way, there are some virtues of that. There's a really high concentration of people working on diverse aspects of things. For those of you who might be doing a research project course with the EEB 488 class and you come to our seminars, you see there's a big group of people that all have shared interests. And there's a huge expertise. So there are in Canada, there's a couple of other places that are kind of comparable in that respect. So UBC is another one. They don't have an EEB department per se. They have faculty in zoology, botany, and forestry that kind of cover conceptually, and they're also an excellent collection of researchers. Let's see, McGill has also a good concentration in that area as well. There are many other universities in Canada that have excellent researchers in ecology and evolution, but it will be like a smaller number of faculty that would be devoted just because they're smaller universities or they prioritize different aspects of life sciences in terms of what faculty expertise they have. So depending on, we can come back to this, but depending on like what your interests are, if you're like, super excited about this one thing and really the best person to do it with is at, Laurentian or something, then that may be a good rationale for going there because you know exactly what you want to do. They have really good expertise or what have you. But just keep in mind in terms of like the broader culture of the academic environment, it'll probably be people working on things that are actually quite dissimilar like that to what you do. Okay, so one kind of key thing about a master's or PhD degree is it's really non-vocational. Like you're not getting trained to do a particular thing. You're working on a particular research project that involves particular kinds of skills, but it's not like you're getting a certificate to have this particular job, okay? And so what you would want to think about it as is you're actually getting pretty advanced skills in a broad range of things that could then be applied in many different ways, okay? So if you want to just get some kind of certification to get a particular job, that's where actually some of these course-based master's things may be more appropriate because it's really catered to like becoming this particular thing, right? And doing a research-based master's or PhD is not really in that vein, okay? So one cool thing about a research-based thesis though, is that you can kind of help decide what cross-section of skills you hope to develop over your time as a graduate student, whether it ranges from, really primarily focusing on data analysis, although frankly, no matter what you do, you're going to have some of that. But depending on what you're doing, it may vary in terms of like how you approach it, whether it's more computational or statistical or mathematical modeling kinds of an approach to that. Of course, you can get at like big biological data sets. So whether you're dealing on kind of the genetic side of things or the landscape ecology side of things, looking at like GIS or museum collections, with some of our connections to government that have these huge data sets of like basically all the lakes in Ontario, which is thousands of lakes. There's huge kind of data sets that you can access for analyzing. One of the key things is that you're really building up your problem solving and creative thinking. For those of you who may have worked with a graduate student in a lab, if you've had a research project experience, then you probably know that part of that you may not see on the side you've been on is that you kind of learn about kind of team management and project planning and organization. And then, of course, really getting comfortable with writing and presentation and talking in front of people and communicating science in different ways. Of course, there are some things that we do not for practical reasons, but because we love them and it makes us happy. And so oftentimes for students, that's just getting to experience the natural world. So whether it's, being able to do field work in different places, like up in, say, Churchill, Manitoba, if you're a student of Peter Kotonen at University of Toronto, Mississauga, or doing field work in South America, like many of our faculty here do, or wherever else. Or at KSR, just like a short right away, the Kaufman Scientific Reserve. And depending on what your interests are, there's a huge range of ways you can do experiments, whether in the lab, in greenhouses, at KSR. Many other institutions will have comparable kinds of resources, but that's the kind of thing that if you're really interested in one aspect of stuff, to be sure to kind of ask about that and find out. Yeah, and one other thing that you probably haven't had exposure to as an undergrad is presenting science at conferences, and in particular traveling, for example, to international conferences to present your work, either as a poster or as an oral presentation. And so that's kind of the norm that's expected once you're getting up to this kind of research discovery phase of things. So let's see. This is probably a little bit redundant with what I've been just saying, but in terms of thinking about why you might study EEB in grad school here at U of T, well, our program goals are really to help students develop into scientists who are really capable of doing lots of different things, approach things in a really thoughtful and ethical kind of way, and will go on to do, whatever. So maybe 20% or so of our PhD graduates will stay on an academic career path and become a professor. That's the path I happen to take. But what that means is most of them do something different than that. And so what we hope is that you'll learn a lot of good stuff that will let you succeed in whatever it is you choose to do after graduation. Okay, so I'm sure you're kind of a little bit familiar with what some of the expertise is. We'll hear from some of our grad student panelists today that come out of a couple of these labs as well as another, but we have a pretty broad range of things. So Jacqueline's lab, they study kind of evolutionary limits of populations using Drosophila fruit flies and studying genetic variation and things like that. So it's very genetics-y. Selena's lab studies movement ecology, especially dispersal and other kinds of things, but also using modeling and stuff like that, but for ecological questions. Tomo's lab is primarily computational in approach and using kind of a more phylogenetic scale of looking at things. And I've just kind of pulled these kind of three examples of kind of to represent kind of the span of things. But there's as you might guess, when we have 50 faculty, there's, you can divide things finer and spread them even broader than this. So another point that I have this up here is if you're thinking about grad school, one key thing, whether it's here at U of T or at another institution, is to browse the web pages of faculty and kind of look at like what their expertise is. So our departmental web page kind of has things broken down in a few ways. You can just sort of look at a list of people, right? And so maybe you've had them in class and oh, they taught about that, they must know about that, and that's the topic I find interesting. Or maybe, but the reality is actually, there's probably a bunch of other professors here that also find that topic interesting. And so there's another part of our faculty group that groups people by kind of categories. So like more or less by these kind of categories that I have listed up here. And so especially if you're a U of T student based at one campus, there may be folks at Scarborough or UTM, if you've been doing your undergrad at St. George or vice versa, that are actually even more closely aligned to your interests than you may have appreciated. So that's a see, okay, who are the folks that are doing kind of closest to what I think I want to do. It's also a way to kind of gauge that if you actually find lots of things interesting, one thing about grad school is you do kind of have to start to narrow a little bit and start to kind of choose. The good thing is we've got lots of excellent researchers, and all of them are nice people too, for the most part. And we can come back to that kind of issue in a second when it comes to like thinking about who for a supervisor. And so what you can then do if you identify a handful of people is to reach out and contact them about whether they're planning to recruit new students. And part of the reason that's important to do is that it may be they're going to go on sabbatical next year, and so are not looking to take new students into their lab. Or maybe actually they're going to retire in 2 years, and so they don't want to take PhD students because they wouldn't be around to be able to help supervise them. Or maybe actually their lab is full and they don't have enough funds to support any additional students. And so these are reasons why it's good to have a collection of people that you think you might share research interests with, so that if some of them, it turns out, are not viable for these reasons that have nothing to do with you in particular, there are other folks that you can draw on with shared interests, okay? Okay, some nuts and bolts type things. So when to apply? Well, the application portal just opened on November 1st. So for that, you go through the School of Graduate Studies admission thing. They do charge you an application fee if you're in financial need. If that's a hardship for you, we do have some bursaries for our program to waive that application fee. In terms of deadlines for Canadian applicants, so citizens and permanent residents, the deadline's January 9th. For international applicants, December 8th. We have that slightly earlier deadline because there are some scholarships that we can nominate international applicants for that has a tight turnaround. And so we want to make sure that we can put them forward for those. Let's see. So typically the program starts in September of the academic year. In some circumstances, it's possible to start in January instead. But nonetheless, in terms of application, it's the same deadline for the application. I'll also mention that if you're planning to apply for grad school, whether master's or PhD, you may be eligible for the NSERC CGSM award. So this is a competitive scholarship that pays basically most of your stipend and makes you much more attractive as like a prospective recruit to a professor's lab. So Helen Rod led a workshop on October 21st, so that's passed, but I believe she recorded it. So if you reach out to her, she can give you a copy of that if you're considering applying for that. Okay, so how do you apply? I'm going to walk you through kind of what we have here in our department. It's probably going to be pretty similar in other programs. So hopefully most of the stuff will apply. So it's a little bit more involved than what you guys had in terms of applying to undergrad for your bachelor's, which in Canada basically means just like clicking a button pretty much as far as I can tell, and your grades get sent somewhere and like that's it. And so here it's a little bit more involved. So yes, you do have to provide your transcript. So that is one part of it, but there are a few other things that are equally, if not more important. So one is a research statement, or what we call a graduate application statement. You can think of it as like a statement of interest. It's really about your potential research interests. It's not really like your life story, but more like your academic background and experiences that kind of have led you to be motivated to pursue graduate school. So you have a page or two for that. Sort of a CV or resume where you have a couple pages for that. I can pull up the portal so you can see we actually, on both our department webpage and on the SES application portal, there's kind of like a bullet list of like kinds of things to think about including in each year's statement and your CV. Transcript, that's pretty straightforward. We also knew this year, and this may be uncommon in other places, we're asking students to self-report the 6 courses that they've had that they think are most prepared them for graduate school. So to kind of let you tell us a little bit what from your transcript is most key to what you like, whether it's like, how it shaped your thinking about something, or it's some practical skill development, or something else, right? And let's see. And then reference letters, you need at least 2 pages of, sorry, not 2 pages, 2 people, to typically faculty members. So these aren't usually like, an employer, like if you worked at a vintage shop or something like that, I'm sure you had a great experience and stuff like that, but really we're looking for academic reference letters. And let's see, and then lastly, we have an optional piece we call an individual history statement. This also is new this year, and this is basically a place where if there are other aspects of your kind of background or experience that doesn't really fit neatly into these other things, then you can kind of add it in there. So it's not meant to be kind of duplicating your research statement of interest type stuff, but if there's other aspects of your own individual experience that ought to be taken into account, then you can incorporate them. Let's see. So when the admissions committee is reviewing these things, it is important to have had some kind of research experience. So whether it was through like a project course or like a summer research fellowship or some kind, those are kind of like the best kind of possibilities for that. And part of it is for your own benefit. Part of it is for your prospective supervisor's benefit. So for your benefit, it's that you kind of know what you're getting into a little bit, right? Like you have a sense of what a research environment is like, and that you're kind of ready to like expand that up to be your life, basically, at least for some amount of time. And for the supervisor's benefit, it's to give them the confidence that you know what you're getting into and that you kind of have some exposure to kind of original scientific data collection and academic writing and presentation and some of those things, right? If you haven't had those kinds of research experiences, then kind of maybe a work study position in a lab or field course or something like that. And there are different types of field courses, some that have a little bit more of a heavy duty project component to them than others. And so you can play up some of that. Doing like labs you might have done in some of your coursework, it's good. Hopefully you got good experience from that. But I hope if you've had any research experience, you'll know that it's a pretty different kind of approaching labs, right? So most labs that you would have as part of a course that are tagged onto a lecture part of a course, they've been developed to be run like every year. Basically, they know what the answer is going to be. It's to get across a certain idea or a certain skill or something like that, right? It's not truly about discovery. There are some exceptions to that. There are some courses at like 3rd or 4th year that might be a lab course entirely where you have a more kind of hands-on experience, in which case you might be able to play that up if that's the strongest experience you've had. Let's see, I already talked about kind of reviewing faculty profiles. Another kind of point is to talk to your TAs or other graduate students you may have interacted with, or if there are some students that graduated that you were personally friendly with or whatever that have since gone on to grad school, talk to them to get their perspective. Even if they're in a different program, it can give you a little bit of a sense of what kind of day-to-day life is like as a graduate student. And yeah, so some of the details are on some of these web pages, which I might try and pull up in a second, or if there are questions about that. Okay, so that's pretty much all I have. I think we can probably share these slides as well, but what I've kind of listed here are kind of a few sort of common questions that you may have to kind of spark whether there are particular things. But before like kind of jumping in with that, maybe I'll invite our 3 panelists up. Does that sound good? Yeah, you're right here. Okay, you guys want to? Sure. All right. So we're lucky to have, we're lucky to have 3 great grad students with us here today. And I think that's important in these kind of things because, while I know a lot about kind of the grad program and how it works and how it's changed and how we want to change it in the future and stuff like that, it's been a long time since I myself was a graduate student. And so these folks are a little bit closer to kind of your stage of thinking about things and also have different kind of experiences And so they can kind of tie into that. So what I thought I would do is just maybe ask each of you to just kind of introduce yourself, kind of name what kind of professor you're working with and kind of what kind of research topic. And then if there's any like initial thoughts on things you were thinking when you were making the transition from undergrad to grad school.
Hi everyone, I'm Hannah. I am first year PhD student in Niall Rawlinson's lab. And my PhD is focused on studying movement ecology in turtles and salamanders at Algonquin Park. And I did my undergrad here at U of T at St. George. I also did my master's here, but at the UTM campus with Cassidy Deloya. So if any of you are considering, professors at other campuses, you can ask me about that. And I mean, going into it, I just decided to do a master's first, just because I figured it would be good to kind of get a sense of what it's like to do grad school without like the big 5-year commitment. So yeah, the master's went well, and I decided to continue with a PhD. So that's something to consider, I think, whether to start with a master's or PhD. And yeah, I mean, clearly I love this department since I've been here for a while. So yeah, if you have any questions about that as well, let me know.
Cool. And I'm Nikki. I'm in the 3rd year of my PhD in Selena Bain's lab. And I study how climate change and species interactions affect dispersal. And I'm really lucky that I get to do this in a lot of different ways. So I go do field work at KSR, I do lab work, and I have stuff going on in the greenhouse. I've also done theoretical modeling stuff, and I'm really lucky that I got funding to go to Scotland for 4 months and like collaborate there. So another great thing about this department is that there's potential to collaborate elsewhere, which is great. And I did my undergrad at U of T as well and did direct entry into the PhD program. And quite a few things kind of went into that decision. I did a lot of undergraduate independent research projects, like too many, arguably. I did like 397 for both the like EEB program and a 3rd year project in the School of the Environment, and same with 4th year projects in EEB in the School of the Environment. And ultimately it like had me really well prepared to kind of be individually motivated and think about research questions. And I thought it was really cool, and it kind of made me sure that I was interested in a research project. And the types of questions that I was interested in happened to be things that would take longer and be over the scope of a PhD rather than in the timeline of a master's. And yeah, obviously I also liked it here, so stayed. But honestly, COVID really influenced that decision. My 4th year of undergrad, when I was applying to grad school, was right when we came back from COVID, and it was in a very touchy spot where things were finally in person for the first time in a couple of years now. And still there was masking and a lot of uncertainty, and I felt like I wanted to stay close, and that really helped me like really look within the department as well. Yeah.
I'm Thomas. I am in the 3rd year of my PhD. I'm in the Stepanek and Parents-Ficucci labs. I'm in the like theoretical and computational side of things. I use a lot of simulation models to try figure out how the sort of theory we apply at short evolutionary timescales can apply to much longer macroevolutionary timescales where millions of generations have occurred. My background, like I also did my undergrad in U of T. I came to university to study initially like computer science and math. Kind of wound up finding like this niche in EEB over the course of my undergrad. But I also like did internships in software development. And that kind of like shaped my academic interests as well. I started off in the master's program here, and after about a year, I transferred into the PhD program in EEB. So I definitely wanted to start in the master's when I was applying out of undergrad, because I'm not like the most decisive person and my interests tend to meander a little bit. So I started off in the master's. not thinking I would switch into the PhD, but over time, my supervisors were really great with giving me a lot of like space to kind of like figure out what I was really interested in and explore a lot of different like questions. And I think that I kind of like found something that I really wanted to like continue and figure out at a deeper level, because the master's program is on the shorter side. So I kind of got like hooked on figuring out certain things, and that's why I transferred into the PhD program.
Thanks for Thomas for bringing that up in particular. I meant to mention that that is a formal possibility to start in the math in our program, not necessarily all programs, but to start as a master's student, and then between basically months 6 and 10, you can have what's called a transfer exam that can allow you to switch into the PhD program if that's something that makes sense. So not all programs necessarily have that kind of a pathway, but it is one pathway that we also have. That said, I mean, I think it's probably important to think about like wherever you start graduate school, to jump into it with both feet, whether it is in a master's or a PhD you're doing. Anyway, so thank you guys for those introductions. Now it's just kind of reform. Questions for each of you, if from the audience or for me as well.
I guess they mentioned like for the letters of reference, it's ideally faculty members. Would grad students be okay? Like for example, you know, your PhD student, if you got a letter of reference from them, would that work?
Yeah, so the question about reference letters, is it okay to have a PhD student as the letter writer? So it's sort of in that typically what would happen is if you were working really closely with a graduate student, what you might do is approach them about this and the faculty member to see if they could jointly put it together. And so it may be that in reality, the graduate student is writing much of it, like the actual information, but it's on letterhead and signed by a professor. And if they're like me, when in cases where I've done that kind of a thing, I'll say that, you know, this particular PhD student had these experiences and tell me this. So to make it clear, you know, who's the authority on some of that kind of information. And I think that can help give it a little bit more gravitas in some ways, unfortunately, that like me having a PhD after my name, whereas a graduate student doesn't, like there is still a little bit of a difference there in terms of how it may be perceived. Yeah.
I have a similar question about the reference letters, but it has to do with faculty. So I heard from Nikki, like doing things in the School for the Environment and doing things in EEB. I'm in a similar position. Does it matter what faculty, like departmental association that letter comes from, or is it just kind of faculty?
No, and remember U of T is kind of, we're the only EEB department in Canada. So all of our students who did their undergrad somewhere else in Canada, they may have done a project in like the equivalent of a CSB lab or a physics lab or a chemistry lab, or it doesn't matter. The key thing is you had some, one of the key values is having had some kind of prior experience where a prof got to know you well, your abilities and your skills and stuff like that.
And honestly, I thought it was beneficial to have both the School of the Environment and EEB profs kind of write reference letters, because honestly, they were quite different. For the School of the Environment, I was in environmental ethics as my major, and the types of projects and writing and skills that I was getting for that major honestly was very different than the types of actual research projects I was doing at EEB. So I felt like they emphasized different skill sets like nicely.
Also, I think like showing that you have like broad range of experiences and you've tried different. If you have people from other departments, then I think that's like an added thing rather than.
I have a couple of questions, but I'll just wait my turn for the rest of them. For the NSERC CGSM, can that apply to a PhD as well, or?
So
I mean, I don't know what the breakdown is, because I think actually first year grad students also can apply for the CGSM. The key thing is that the CGSM, it only provides, I think, 12 months of funding support. So, yeah, so it could be that you're applying to be a master's student, or it could be applying to be a PhD student, but it only would provide, at your stage, you would provide funding just for that first year. And then once you're in the program, you could then apply, for example, the doctoral version of it, which provides another potentially 3 years. So some of our students are successful in both of those, so that they essentially have 4 years of NSERC funded fellowship.
Yeah, it's always recommended to apply for the CGSM first.
Yeah, so that's actually what I ended up doing. So you can apply for the CGSM, like when you're applying for grad school. I actually started my like grad school term in January rather than the September start date. So in your first year, you're still of your PhD, you're still eligible to apply for the CGSM. So since by the time the next December came around, I was still within a year of the start date of my program, I was actually able to apply again, because when I was just getting into grad school, I didn't get it. But the second time I applied for it, I got it, and that gave me a year of funding before I got the CGSD. So it ended up extending the total amount of funding I could get.
Got another question?
I've been like warned that it's like it looks really bad to do like a master's before your PhD, and it looks like you're like uncertain, or like that it's not a good look when you're planning on doing academics or career wise. Is that the case, or is that just like old people?
I've never
I really disagree with that, yeah.
I mean, I would say that historically in Canada in particular, it has had in the past especially been much more common to do a PhD and to then do a, to do a master's and to then do a PhD. I think it gets a little bit blurred, like if you're in like Thomas's situation where you start in a master's and you switch to PhD, so he's not going to get a master's, right? And there's a couple other things. If you know you're jazzed about grad school and think you want to get a PhD, like frankly, my advice is to just apply to the PhD. And part of the, unless you're really not sure of the direction you want to go. And the reason I say that is because the time it takes to get a PhD is not that strongly affected by whether or not you have a master's beforehand. So although in our funding thing, we guarantee funding for 4 years if you previously had a master's, the actual in practice time it takes is not all that much shorter for students that already completed a master's. And so, so what it means is that if you do a master's and then a PhD, like the total amount of time in grad school will be longer. Which, maybe that's what you're going for, in which case,
Just to play devil's advocate, I would say, I mean, for one, most of you are pretty young, and so I think taking a little bit longer is not a big deal. But also I would say like a PhD is a big commitment. Like it is many, many years. It's at least 5 years, especially if you go straight from undergrad. And at least even for me, like it can be kind of tough to like know what that is really like and to like make that big commitment going in. And so I would say if you're at all, and like there are people who do start a PhD and then realize it wasn't really for them, or maybe the thing that they focused on is kind of changing. And some people, end up like leaving halfway through and just getting a master's or something. So I would say like if you don't feel like super, super certain about that decision, then definitely consider the master's. And I don't think there's any negativity around that at all. I don't think anybody views that poorly. Yeah.
I will say my supervisor has a master's and a PhD, and I don't think that is like,
Yeah, no.
and I think she's like a pretty great like scientist. I did like transfer from my master's to my PhD. I will say if you want to get a PhD, definitely don't apply to like the master's in this program with the expectation that you can just switch up if you want to, because that's definitely not like a guaranteed option. So if you want a PhD, like I would say apply for a PhD, right?
Yeah, I will concur. The transfer thing is definitely not guaranteed.
Yeah, and I agree with both of them. If you want to do a master's, or if you're not sure if you want to do a PhD, just do a master's. It does
Yeah.
not hurt at all. And the PhD is a big commitment. It's a lot longer. So really buckle up, you're like in it. So yeah, it definitely doesn't hurt to do the master's. And I had so much research experience as an undergrad that I knew I was comfortable in research, felt like I had some good research questions that I was actually interested in, so my own research interests. I was used to like the free form self-motivation that's kind of required to do an actual research project. And that all helped me make a very informed decision to go directly into my PhD. And I feel like if I didn't have that, it would have been a very big change for me.
Also, another thing I would say is like a lot of people, like for example, Nikki, very lucky, like she kind of knew what sort of questions she was interested in and what she wanted to focus on. But for me, it wasn't really the case. Like I knew I was interested in doing research and I was broadly interested in a lot of different things within EEB, but I didn't have like this really like burning thing that I'm like, I want to work on that. And so if you're in, and like, I feel like academia kind of tends to be like, oh, you should know the specific research question that you want to do. And like, if you don't, you need to go and figure it out. I would say that's not necessarily true. Like, it's fine to not know the very specific thing that you want to study. And in that sense, I think a master's would probably might be a better option because then it can help you kind of figure out, okay, this is what I'm really interested in, or this is what I want to focus on. So it's completely fine to not feel like you know exactly the types of questions that you want to study in the beginning.
I 100% agree. And I think kind of as Asher mentioned, it's a lot about transferable skills. And as an undergrad, I remember asking a master's student who was my TA at the time, he was doing snake stuff or whatever. And I, as an undergrad, was very panicked about grad school and what's next, and everything was very scary. And I was like, how did you know that you wanted to study this and this one specific snake for the rest of your life? And he was like, it's not for the rest of my life. It's just, I'm doing a research project, and it is whatever the duration of a master's is, or whatever the duration of a PhD is. And you're not so trapped for the rest of your life. And sometimes that's kind of nice to keep in mind, that you're getting research experience on a project and you're going to get so many different skills from that, and you can take it and do whatever you want next.
Some people definitely are like knowing like I want to study beetles since they're like 5 or something. Like definitely not that type of person. Like my interests tend to kind of like ping pong all over the place. But I will like say if you're talking to a potential supervisor, like it's probably good to have like an idea of what their expectations are in terms of whether you're going to come up with, you know, a project to work on, or whether they have something more particular in mind. Some students tend to prefer that there's like a specific idea that they want to work on and like given to them by a professor. And the professor has some project that needs to be completed. And then sometimes it's more of a like, we'll take you on and like you'll kind of like figure out where we want to go with this. I think there's like pros and cons to like both of these. And my end was like going in without much of a real project, maybe kind of like some general ideas kind of bouncing around, but not like I want you to figure out this question. It was more like, you know, show up and figure it out. That's really great if you're like fulfilled by like I don't know, just a lot of freedom and just chasing your own interest deeply. But it can also be like kind of a long haul process. Like it's not like a very like quick thing to, you have to like kind of stumble around and get your footing and stuff for a while. So definitely figure out what type of experience like the beginning part of your graduate degree would look like with your supervisor.
So that point might tie into we have a couple questions in the chat. And so this first one, I'll just read it out. It says, just to clarify, I noticed the slide said that you need to list potential supervisors on the application. Knowing this, do I need to identify exactly who I'll be supervising me before I apply, or do I submit potential supervisors on my application and decide later? So, so you do to to kind of get evaluated early on in the application cycle, you do need at least one faculty member who you've kind of spoken to in advance and who's kind of sponsoring your application. So that there's no obligation there for them or for you in terms of like going to their lab or what have you. It's just that it's to encourage you to kind of reach out to profs in advance, because with our program in particular, you would be admitted into a particular supervisor's lab. And so you want to get that conversation going sooner than later. So it may be that, you know, you've mainly been talking to this one prof, but there are like 2 or 3 others that seem like they'd also be a good fit, and you could mention them like in your letter. Like you do want to write specific people's names in that grad application statement, but you also want to reach out to them and potentially talk to them either in person or at least virtually, like if they're at a different institution or something like that, about things. So I think that is kind of a key thing that is important to make that kind of personal connection at some level.
I mean, another suggestion is to definitely talk to people in the lab that you're interested in, other than like just the professor, so that you understand like the kind of culture in the lab and just like the style of it, how things work. There's like a lot of variance, I think, in just how labs operate throughout the department. I'm co-supervised, so that's also something that I think a lot of students in our faculty or department are co-supervised. It's also a possibility. So you want to like talk to current students if they have any, and also past students if they have any. That's pretty great. I think you can maybe get different perspectives from people that are no longer in the lab and don't and have gone on to do other things. But yeah, big differences in lab culture, I think, and you want to like make sure that that suits you and your goals.
Yeah, so part of just one last point, which Thomas was sort of alluding to, is part of the reason you want to make that personal connection is, one, to kind of get your foot in the door in terms of the application, but also like you're kind of interviewing them. Like, do you actually want to spend 5 years of your life with this person? And I mean, I think our department, we're lucky that all of our profs are like good people and good to work with, but they're occasionally in different programs, sometimes there are faculty that are really difficult to work with, or maybe it's not even that the person is a bad person, but just your styles are different. So Thomas kind of alluded to this idea of, you know, how hands-on or hands-off are they in terms of their mentorship? Like, are they gonna kind of let you kind of do what you want, but it's sort of a sink or swim kind of an outlook? Or are they going to be breathing down your neck or somewhere in between? And like, what is it that you actually need to kind of help you kind of make the most of your time? So making sure there's like a good match between how you know yourself and what you think would help you to do well and what their style is going to be. And part of that is going to be talking to their current and recent graduate students. So, I mean, you should always ask to see if you can talk to them. Hopefully, most potential supervisors will actually offer that as an option. But if they don't, then you should proactively ask to speak with your students. Were you going to say something?
I would just reiterate, like, that's the most important thing. I think the most important factor is like you're talking to your supervisor, and it's not just about your research interests aligning, but yeah, making sure that you can have a good working relationship with them. Like even if you're applying, for example, if you're applying to other universities, they might like invite you to come visit the university for a day. We've had like in my master's lab, we had a student come visit from the US. She stayed for a couple of days, just to get a sense of what the lab is like, what the supervisor is like. And like when I was speaking to supervisors, you know, I had like a list of questions that I wanted to ask them. It's not just them asking me. And definitely speaking to other people in the lab is super important. And yeah, I would say like that's like the most important factor.
I had a question about co-supervision, but it was co-supervision across like divisions or faculties. I've seen that some labs do take like cross-faculty students. What's the process for that, and like which department should you apply to in that case? And is there like a hierarchy of who you should mention in your application versus who might follow as like a secondary name?
So you have to be admitted through a particular program, a graduate program, because they have specific graduation completion requirements. And then within a program, it is possibly to be co-supervised. So like in Thomas's case, both his supervisors are in the EEB program. But in the past, I had one PhD student who was co-supervised with a prof whose appointment actually was in physics. And so the nature of the project was stuff, he was making all these contraptions to like measure these tiny little worms on microscope slides and stuff. And that's what this physicist, that was like his bag. And so, so he was like a co-supervisor, but for that to happen, this physics prof had to like get like an affiliation with our graduate program. And so the thing to do would be to, again, this is where it becomes important if you have some ideas about what kind of things you might be keen on doing in that way, would be to talk to a supervisor first about that idea. And it may be that they think, oh, well, actually, we already have that sort of expertise. There's no reason to make it more complicated, because it is a little bit more complicated when you have more bodies in the room. It's harder to like coordinate everything sometimes, but there can be perks of that. So I myself had two supervisors. One was kind of an evolutionary ecologist, and the other was like a cell biologist. And for me, that worked great. But some students can, depending on the nature, and also thinking about that supervisor-student relationship, now you have to manage like two student-supervisor relationships as well as the supervisor-supervisor relationships. So it starts to get complicated potentially quickly if people aren't all on the same page with expectations and things like that. So I think then it becomes even more important to make sure that people are communicating effectively and have shared expectations. So that sometimes can be tricky if they're in very different disciplines where the expectations actually genuinely differ between the different programs, right? And so that said, it's not like it's like a no-go thing. It's just something that you would probably want to start exploring like sooner than later, because there may be bureaucratic kind of hurdles, actually. Maybe I'll take one more from the virtual. Maybe we can go back and forth a little bit. Okay, so this next one is, if you get accepted into two graduate programs, what's the best way to decline one professor without burning any bridges? Okay, did any of you guys have to deal with this kind of situation?
I did.
Okay.
Yeah, for my PhD, I had applied here and at McMaster. And yeah, I mean, I had like acceptances from both. It was, I mean, the McMaster one was a bit specific because even though it was technically like a behavioral ecology lab, it was in a psychology department, which was a little bit weird. And I would have been living here and commuting to Hamilton. So there were like some specific reasons that I could, and also the stipend was a lot lower. So there were a lot of like really specific reasons that I could like communicate to the professor. But I think in general, I think professors are pretty like, they know, especially if like in the beginning you're saying, sometimes they'll ask you like, oh, are you considering other places? Like there's never this like expectation that, you know, oh, if you're applying, that means you're definitely gonna come and join my lab. So I think professors are kind of used to that, and I don't know, I'm not sure you can say, but I don't think that they have like an issue. They won't be like, oh, this person just rejected me or anything like that. I think they normally take it pretty normally, as long as you're respectful, you're not like, you know, waiting till the last minute or something. You let them know like as soon as you make your decision. It's not a big deal.
No. And I mean, in fact, I think it's fair to say like we're one of the best research programs in the world. And so we expect that our students are going to be applying to other competitive places. And so sometimes they're going to choose to go there, and it could be for like partly personal reasons. It could also just be for academic reasons. And I mean, I think most professors have the view that, you know, we want students to go to the place that they think they're going to get the most out of personally, right? And so it's hard, you can't really hold a grudge against someone for that. So that said, I think from the applicant student side, I mean, is to just approach it professionally, because you might encounter them at like conferences and things, right? And so you just, it's easy. You just write an email to them and just kind of say that, you know, you really appreciated the chance to consider their lab for grad school. It's really exciting research they're doing. But on balance, given your like personal and professional aspirations, you've decided to go wherever you decided to go. And that, like, just be professional about it, right? And then you say, hope to, you know, that you'll get a chance to interact with them in the future or something, right? Like, I mean, it's just sort of being like a nice person, I guess. And yeah, and if they responded badly to that, then you made the right choice of not going to their lab, right? So okay, there was a hand up over here.
But yeah, for the life history section of the application for the EEB program, like I know it says optional, like how optional is it? Like, you know, lots of these programs have like certain parts of the application that are like optional, but like how does that sort of weigh out here?
So frankly, this is the first year we actually have that kind of explicitly written in the way that it is. And part of, I mean, I don't know how much to get into the weeds here, but in the past few years, we had something that it was called EDI statement. And there was like basically no information for applicants on what to put there. And in fact, especially for international applicants where that North American jargon was like a totally foreign concept, it was like they either put nothing or whatever. And so it was not helpful at all to the admissions committee. And so we have this individual history statement that's comparable to some things that some other institutions do. And it's just a way for like, if there are aspects of like like if you didn't have opportunity to be able to get a certain kind of experience that you think would have made you more competitive or something like that, then you can kind of outline that, or you overcame some kind of adversities that are not sort of obvious from kind of your academic record that speak to your ability to like follow through on some of these self-motivated type things that Nikki was just mentioning, right? So it is true in graduate school, you need to be very self-motivated in a way that's pretty different from undergrad because you're not having homework assignments and tests and these regular checkups on you making headway, right? Like it's 5 years, that's longer than your undergrad in many of your cases, right? And you have to be kind of taking ownership over all of that. And so, and that can be a really hard transition. And so anyway, I'm getting a little bit off track here, but the point being, if there are kind of aspects of kind of your personal experience that aren't like strictly speaking about your grades or about like, you know, what lab you managed to do a summer NSERC in or whatever, but still speak to some of the qualities that could make you successful as a grad student, then that could be a place to put them in. In some cases, it may be appropriate to put them in your like regular statement as well, but this gives you another kind of opportunity. Does that make sense a little bit?
No, I think that makes sense. But like, if you were to like not submit that, would you be at like a
No.
Okay.
You wouldn't be disadvantaged, assuming that you put compelling things in.
Yeah, assuming everything else is like perfect. Okay.
All right, maybe we'll bounce back here. And I think there had been another hand up, and I'll come back to that in a second. So this third one here, how much research experience would be expected if you were to apply to the PhD direct entry? So, I mean, I think there's some expectation that you would have had some exposure to kind of thinking about original research. So at U of T, it probably would be in the vein of like, you know, having done an ROP project, but it might have been chemistry, or it might have been School of the Environment, or like a summer NSERC or summer KSR award or something like that. Again, it could have been through like, you know, a totally different discipline. The point is that you've had some exposure to the original research endeavor of some kind. So you have a sense of what you're getting into. And also that there's like a professor who can kind of speak to those abilities and qualities that presumably they would be one of your reference letter writers, right? So I think if your only exposure to kind of a lab environment, say, was through, you know, like your genetics course lab, or Bio 220, or I don't know, Chem 300 and something. I don't know what course chemistry might have, but that might be seen as a little bit of a stretch to go direct entry PhD. I mean, there could be extenuating circumstances, like say you had taken, you had done an internship or a year off and you were working for like IBM or something, and like, I don't know, like doing some kind of coding, or you were working for the conservation authority, like you had some work experience where you were like doing something that was going to be a direction that you were hoping to take your grad work, then that kind of, there are kinds of work experience that I think could fulfill that, that kind of thing as well. Or I know I have one master's student who their undergrad, like third, fourth year was kind of down during the lockdown COVID period, so didn't really have much chance to get a research experience. And so she ended up doing kind of like this certificate program through TMU in like machine learning or something. And so that was like a cool experience that she ended up actually bringing into her master's research project. So I mean, there are other ways to do it. And kind of if you're at the stage of applying for grad school, it's like, you know, and you haven't had research experience, then you may want to think about either a master's, or if you're considering like some alternative possibilities to gain experience in different ways, and like have a gap year or something like that. I don't know if you guys have other thoughts on this.
Yeah, I don't think you need to do like so many things to like as a requirement, but do something. Keep in mind that you're competing with other students that may have a master's from the same program. So the master's students already have obvious research experience that makes them competitive. So if you want to do direct entry, you need to bring something to the table that also makes you a competitive applicant, whether it's an independent research project through U of T, an internship, a course that really affected you, whatever. Just make sure that there's something there, I think.
I think probably just having something. I did the 498, but I didn't really have much research experience outside of that. I did have like work experience that was relevant for like the topics I was interested in. But I also, like with COVID, I had never stepped foot in a wet lab before, like starting a degree in evolutionary biology here, which is like, you know, there's space for a lot of different backgrounds, I think, in this department. So I mean, it's really up to like, if you, like, what are you actually wanting to do during your PhD? And but it's probably best to have some kind of, if possible, engagement with like independent research in your undergrad. So I was fine with 498.
Were there other hands up earlier that I skipped over? Any other things you guys have on your mind? I do have like these kind of potential questions here that sometimes come up, in case any of them. Oh, yes.
Do you know like what ratio of PhD students who are direct to PhD versus who have a master's and then went on to their PhD? I mean, what percent of students are using?
It's about half last year. But that, I mean, we typically have, you know, like 12 to 15 new PhD students each year between Canadian and international combined. And so that's still a small number. So like the fraction that are direct entry can bounce around quite a lot from year to year.
Yeah, I also have a question regarding like course provisioning, like within the department. Like what are the kind of philosophy of like course provisioning? Like for example, like are there like kind of like one supervisor that kind of dominates another supervisor, or it's kind of like equally shared work or something?
I don't know that there's one answer to that. I mean, Thomas will be able to tell you about his particular experience, and it probably depends a little bit on the nature of the work. So I know, like, some of our co-supervised students, one of the supervisors has recently retired. And so they're probably kind of doing less than 50% supervision in terms of the student, but still they're providing their expertise in some way, or it may be part of like, sometimes the co-supervision is because it's related to a project that's a collaboration between the two professors that previously exists. But part of the research in that collaboration may be more associated with one prof than the other. And so depending on the student, it may kind of be, one of them might be more the primary and one secondary. Other cases, it's like pretty 50-50. So I don't know, Thomas, how about your experience?
I think it actually changes over time, like how much face time I get with each supervisor. The way that we've structured my like plans for my dissertation is that we have chapters, like I think we kind of set up so like my first chapter is more in the domain of one supervisor, and the second one is more than the other. And then my third one is just like whatever crazy thing I want to get up to. But overall, like the idea for my research was that it would kind of like connect between the interests of the two labs, because the two labs do have like quite distinct interests. The benefits of that is that I get to engage in like pretty diverse like topics and try a lot of new things that are like pretty cool and fun. Downside is like you have to get comfortable with a lot of like very different stuff like pretty quickly, because like you want to like engage in your lab, right? There's lab meetings, you might have like journal clubs or whatever. So you want to be able to like speak the language of each lab that you're in, and have the same kind of like background on the literature that they're drawing from. So it can be like really fun and rewarding. It can also be kind of a challenge to like get caught up to speed in two labs at the same time. But my experience with regards to like who's more involved, it definitely, in my case, averages out to be like an even split. Sometimes I'm just, you know, spending more time with one more than the other. But yeah, it averages out in my case.
Yeah.
I was wondering if any of you have like any experience taking time away from education, either in between like undergrad and grad or master's, PhD, and like, or if you have any opinions on how that might affect the process, kind of.
My experience is a little bit different. So when I joined U of T, I was doing like a second bachelor. So I had like many years of like my first bachelor in like a completely different field, working in that field for a couple of years before like making a complete like career change. And I would say like I didn't feel like that like prohibited me in doing anything. I was never, you know, I felt like if anything it added to my experiences. So if you have like if you, for example, work for a bit before joining grad school, I feel like you're bringing in more skills, more life experience. There's always something that you can add. I don't think it removes anything.
I know I've had one PhD student. She did her undergrad at Western and then spent a year or two as like a lab technician, I think at UTM, if I remember, in like an anthropology lab or something like that before she started grad school with me. Actually, another PhD student, he did his undergrad at UBC, and he also, I think, worked as a lab technician for a year or two. I mentioned that master's student who did like a certificate. I guess that's still kind of academic training, but doing like a certificate kind of program. Let's see, I personally did my undergrad, and then, I mean, it's sort of a cheating gap year in that I got this like it's kind of like a research fellowship where I spent a year in Australia before I started my PhD. So it was a non-degree program, but I was kind of doing field work. So, I mean, I think there's a couple practical components to to consider if you're thinking about that. One is if you do think you're going to apply to grad school later on, that you're going to need those reference letters. And so the more time that elapses, the fuzzier people's memory becomes of you. And so if you do have some faculty who do know you well, it might be worth like applying for scholarships or something, or applying for something that requires a reference letter so that they can write a reference letter now while they know you. And then they have that on file. So if 2 years from now you're going to apply to grad school, they can kind of pull it out and dust it off with some updates of what you've been doing since, but they don't have to do it from scratch. So that's like a practical thing. And then a second thing is it's probably good, even if you have some gap, that you're doing something that is kind of building your sort of professional development in some way, right? So that you would be able to expand your CV in some capacity. Those are a couple things to think about.
For me, I started in January rather than September, but the application process is essentially you're doing everything with the same cohort of students that would be starting in September. So around this time of year, I did my applications for grad school. I had all my references written and submitted. So all of the application things were done, but I got some extra time before actually jumping into grad school, and it worked out that way because of some logistics with me and my supervisor, and ultimately ended up being really, really good for me. Undergrad's a lot, and I felt like I needed a little bit of a breather before going into grad school. But since I already had done all of the application for grad school stuff and was already accepted, and the period of time wasn't that long, there wasn't any expectation or pressure for me to need to get more work experience during that time. So during those months, that was the first time in my life where I was unemployed and not a student, and it was exactly what I needed to raise morale before going into grad school. So I think if you're interested in taking some time off is to have a little bit of a breather and maybe to raise morale a little bit, that's an option as well.
If you do have student loans, pay attention to their obligations as well, though.
Yeah.
So one question that hasn't come up that often comes up is, whether it's better to go to a different institution than where you did your undergrad, or if it's okay to stay at the same institution. And I think that can be a tricky one. So, I mean, part of it ties into just your own personal situation. And so for some people, getting the hell out of town is they need to do that for their sanity. And for other folks, actually to maintain their sanity, they need to stay where they have a support structure or something, right? So those can be important features. I know, so I did my undergrad in the US at a university around Boston, and it was, 10 times smaller than U of T. There were, of people that could be in our department here, there were maybe 2 or 3 such faculty. It was a general biology department. And the advice I got was to go somewhere else. It was an excellent university as an undergrad, but for grad school, it does not make the ranking, so to speak. And so part of that was just because I had a bunch of research experiences in undergrad, and the logic was kind of well, you've kind of used up the expertise that they have, and some not used it up, but you always can gain more as a graduate student. But I'd been exposed to it, and it's a good idea to get exposed to a different cross section of ideas and approaches at a different place. And I mean, I think that is good advice. Where it's a little different is in the Canadian system, and U of T in particular. This is one of the biggest universities in the world. This is one of the biggest departments of its kind in the world. And so there's no way as an undergrad you've come anywhere close to maxing out what you can learn from the expertise in here, especially when you think of the 3 campuses as well. And so there's so that argument kind of goes away. And then just for better or worse, the resources really are excellent at U of T. And so that's why I think it is good to compare and contrast what things different places have to offer. And for depending on what you're doing, it may be the lived experience that's the important thing. I know I grew up in Boston. I went to university in Boston, and I wanted to go somewhere different. And when I interviewed at the University of Arizona in Tucson, Arizona, it overlapped my spring break. I rented a car. It was like 95 degrees, and there were like the saguaro cactus on the horizon. I was like, all right, I'm sold. Like it was, there was some fraction that was about like the science and the academic part, but there was a big piece that was like, holy cow, this is an alien environment, like nothing I had ever been exposed to. And that was itself like worthy. And so, so these are kind of things that you have to like think about yourself in terms of like what it is you want to get out of it, right? But if you're like a city kid and you don't know how to drive, and the prospect of people like encountering people like once every 4 kilometers because that's the population density is sort of scary for you, then maybe like some of the places you want to take that into account in terms of like what's important to you. Right. And so that said, I think another reason to think of if you were to choose to go someplace else is that you're starting your grad education with intention. So you're picking up and you're like moving to go to this place to do this thing. Right. And it's not sort of a path of least resistance, sort of like just doing it because you can, and you can minimize your life change and what have you. And I think there is value in kind of doing things with intention. And sometimes that involves picking up and going out of your comfort zone to go to a new place. So anyway, how all these different factors like weigh with one another is not something that anyone else can make for you. It's something you have to kind of figure out. And it may be that, you have to compromise on some pieces and in order to prioritize others. So I don't know how much, because you guys both did your undergrad here. And you all of it. Okay, all right, so we don't have much diversity on that axis, unfortunately. Yeah.
Honestly, as I mentioned, COVID really influenced my decision. Like we just got back, and during COVID, I was online from my home in New Jersey. So I felt like when we were coming back and I was applying that I didn't really have time in Toronto yet. I didn't have the Toronto experience, and I didn't really have the U of T experience. And the world was so uncertain that I wasn't ready to change and felt like I wanted to really have the U of T experience. I knew there was a lot of great opportunities and resources here. So at the time, that felt like a great decision to stay. And I'm happy here. Don't worry, everything's great. But honestly, when I went to Scotland to collaborate for a few months, that was a great experience, and trying out like a different institution and a little bit of a different like culture in a department. It was really cool. So I think at the time this serves me and this is a great decision, but also it was a little bit like refreshing that when I leave eventually and go to new places, it's going to be okay and fun.
Maybe another question that comes up that kind of aligns with your mention of Scotland is sometimes we get questions about applying to other countries, like grad programs in other countries. So in North America, the US probably has the greatest density of different places that have strong EEB type programs. It's all kind of up in the air, frankly, right now with the politics and the funding of higher ed in the US. So it's hard for me to really encourage that as a destination, to be honest, because it just seems really unclear, like what the prospects are for funding of students and international. If you're a Canadian, you'd be an international student. So
supervisors themselves, honestly.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, we're trying to poach someone from Stanford, so like, anyway, yeah, so anyway, but nonetheless, there are genuinely more places that have strong programs in the US, right? In terms of like, that would be kind of a comparable kind of experience to maybe what you might be able to get here at U of T. There's also Europe. So so Nikki she had kind of like, while a student here, was able to spend some time in the UK. I actually did my postdoc before becoming a professor in Scotland as well, University of Edinburgh in Scotland. So by the way, if you don't know, if you take an academic career path, like after you get a PhD, but before you become a professor, there's this kind of gray zone where you often have what's called a postdoc fellowship or a postdoc research position, where you have a PhD, but you don't have like a permanent faculty position. Anyway, in continental Europe, so like France and Germany in particular, those are the places that probably have the strongest infrastructure for research in general. Some of the Scandinavian countries also are good, but they're much smaller in terms of number of people and institutions. They often work a little bit differently than in North America. So applying to the US is pretty similar to how it would be applying within Canada, in the way that PhDs are structured and masters are structured. And in Europe, it tends to be a little bit more, you apply to a studentship. So like somebody has some grant and they advertise for PhD students to work on this particular project, and then you would apply to that. It's not like this program that we have that you apply to and you work with an individual professor, but all our grad students also have kind of like, there's a whole culture around that. The UK is sort of maybe in between sort of a North American and a continental European kind of model. Also, the European PhDs typically are funded for 3 years. In practice, they typically take 4 years to complete, but it's a shorter period. That said, having spent time there as a postdoc, I would say that getting a PhD in North America, you come out of it with sort of comparable experience as to what getting like a UK PhD plus postdoc time, just because part of it is just time. It takes time to gain experience and expertise. And so that faster PhD in the UK doesn't necessarily transfer to like, faster maturity of thought, essentially. So, but nonetheless, that can be something that's valuable, or if you just want to go to a different place, there are a lot of really good institutions in the UK in particular, but also France, Germany, Sweden. Those are some that come to mind. Other things folks have questions about? Yes.
So all of my research experience has been with the same lab. So I did a summer project with Bontrager Lab, and I'm doing a 498 also with Bontrager Lab. So I was wondering how that would look like on an application if my research experience is like limited to one field.
No, that's great. So I mean, it's not like the bar is not to have had like the equivalent of a 498 project in multiple labs. Like that's kind of going above and beyond. I mean, many students do get excited if they happen to get a research experience in second year and they're like, oh, this is super fun. And then they just keep going and it snowballs. But so one of the positives about doing multiple projects in the same lab is you kind of build up your depth, right? So in a way, it's at a little bit of expensive breadth of different faculty, but you really build it up in terms of depth. So when I've had undergrads who've like published co-authored papers with me, it's usually after they've done like a couple of projects in my lab, because one project, it's like by the end, you kind of you feel comfortable and feel like you know what you're doing, right? And then it's over. And so anyway, so I don't think that is a problem, right? So I mean, it's just you would want to think about in terms of like for your second reference letter. I mean, the person is inevitably going to know you a little bit less, but that's like totally normal. That like if you have a couple of reference letters, that one of them is going to be maybe a little bit more kind of specific and detailed and whatnot than the other, right? And I mean, you can sometimes, depending on like the course, there may be a course instructor that it would be relevant to get a reference letter from. typically that would be in something that's like a small course where they actually know you and your name and stuff. And like occasionally I get students who ask for a reference letter from me in like one of my bigger lecture classes where it's like, you know, if they came to my office, I might recognize their face, but I don't like put their face to their performance or their abilities at all in my head. And the most I would be able to say is by looking up in my like spreadsheet about what their marks were. And that's just on the transcript. So there's no like value added in the reference letter. And so really what you're looking for in a reference is someone who can speak to your abilities and strengths and whatnot in a more direct way.
Would a reference letter from a work study apply kind of for that?
Yeah, so work study would be also another place, and that might, depending on your experience and the nature of the position, it might fall into that category where maybe there was a grad student who you were kind of working with more closely, and so they may kind of collaborate with a prof to kind of make a combined letter of some kind. You know, depending on the nature of the work that you were doing, you know, it's not the same as having to, you know, write a report and give a presentation. So like the kinds of things that they can talk about are going to be much more constrained, but that doesn't mean that it's a problem or that it's bad. It still speaks to your abilities and experience for sure. Oh, we've got another one. Thank you for pointing out the okay. For the minimum grade, like A- for PhD direct entry, does that mean that all the courses in the last year should be above an A-? Or just the average grade above an A-? Just the average?
Yeah, I'm actually glad somebody asked that because I was very panicked about my marks when I was applying as well. And for full transparency, I did not do well at the beginning of my undergrad, like at all. Very bad, actually. But really what's most important is that positive trajectory. Like the trend is what's gonna like really make you stand out. So then in my last couple of years, I ended up doing like really well. So my cumulative GPA like wasn't great, wasn't anything to brag about, but like my sessional GPAs for my last 2 years ended up being like really good. So it worked out.
Yeah, my GPA also. It was the at the cutoff for the last 2 years. I was fine in that regard, but you know, I had a terrible transition to university. Disaster.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, as long as you figure it out along the way, like at some point, like you have to have like meet minimum requirements to be considered, I think, but.
Definitely, that positive trajectory is important. If you are consistently not doing well, that's not great. If you start out doing well in your first year, but by your last couple of years are really not doing well, that's also not great. Just make sure in the last couple of years, like there's either a positive trend or you're consistently doing well. But university is hard and transitioning into university is hard. And there's a lot of like, I felt like as an undergrad, it seemed like everybody else was doing fantastic and I was the only one who was struggling. But at this point, I realized pretty much everybody was struggling at the same time. So it's gonna be okay.
You should try to get good grades though. I mean,
Yeah, try to get good.
definitely like
Don't spiral though if
give-
maybe your first second year thing
put in
was
an effort,
amazing.
but yeah. Although I think sometimes like in terms of like falling off at the end, if you're like, I don't know, I feel like some students like they'll have like, I mean, this isn't common, but like 4.0 for like first year or second year, and then like third and fourth year, if it like slopes off to like a 3.8 or something, it's like you're fine. Like you're still fine. Like that's not like a panic inducing.
No,
thing.
I talk
Freshman.
about trajectory. For full transparency, my first year of undergrad was so rough and I was almost on academic probation. Things were looking pretty dire for a moment. But then I had like my last session, my last year of undergrad, I had a 4.0. So we really recovered. Cumulative GPA, when we take that average, was it remarkable? No, there's really no way for the cumulative GPA to recover from what happened, but it's okay.
I did the same thing, yeah.
Okay. See, this feels very nice. It's unifying.
Okay, I think unless there are other questions, thanks everybody for coming. Hopefully it was useful to you. We will, I think it's being recorded, so I think it'll get posted. So if there are any friends that couldn't make it that you think would find it useful, you be able to pass it along to them.
So if you guys have any follow-up questions, you can reach out. I don't know if
Yeah,
my email
100%.
was shared, but happy to answer questions in the future.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, talk to your TAs, talk to grad students, you know. Thanks, online folks.